Eagles Entertainment.
Eagle Eye in the Sky is fueled by Gatorade, the official sports drink of the Philadelphia Eagles.
Anything that move, I don't care who it is. Let's go. Give me everything you got. Play fast, play hard. Let's beat these boys tonight in their house. It's party time. It's party time. Hey, here we go. Touchdown!
You're listening to the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast. Now here's your host, Fran Duffy.
That's right on the week, and week one is here as the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, fueled by Gatorade, continues. I'm Fran Duffy, and as always, I think we've got a great show for you here on episode number 267. At the top of this week's show, we've got Chalk Talk, where I chat with Greg Cosell from NFL Films about the Eagles and their week one matchup against the Washington football team. It has been a long wait, but we are finally here, and I cannot wait to dive into this week's discussion with the start of the 2020 season, and we're going to preview that game on both sides of the ball. Now, I know you're all excited, and believe me, we are excited too. I caught you guys up a little bit during training camp, but in case you missed it, we are expanding. Remember that survey I asked you all to fill out last year? It was like last December. Well, hundreds of you graciously took the time to fill out that survey, and one of the things we gleaned from that is that you all want more, and we are here to deliver. So not only will we have this episode early in the week every week, but I will be back later this week as well for a second show previewing this matchup with myself, Ben Fennell. We'll have an Eagles player on, other guests, and you guys are, if you're happy to hear this, you'll be excited for more episodes. If you're happy just for the season to be here, if you're excited for Greg Cosell to be back on a weekly basis, if you're happy about all of that, best way to show us your appreciation, throw us your support, go onto the Apple Podcast page, Stitcher, leave us a rating and leave us a comment. If you have a question, I promise you that I will answer it here on the show. And I will be reminding you about this a little bit later, but I really appreciate everybody that takes the time to go on and do exactly that, especially now that we're just on the verge of the start of the 2020 season for the Philadelphia Eagles. All right, enough of that. Let's get into some talk here. It's time for the 2020 season. We're talking Eagles, Washington. Let's dive into our chat now with Greg Cosell in Chalk Talk.
Let's get down to business. It's time for Chalk Talk.
Excited to get things going here for week one of the 2020 NFL season. Greg Cosell, thanks so much for joining us once again here on Chalk Talk on the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, fueled by Gatorade. A little bit different than we're used to. Usually we're in person in the studio here at the NovaCare Complex, obviously with COVID-19 protocols being what they are. You are in your office at NFL Films. I'm sitting in the studio here at the NovaCare Complex. Greg, another season, man.
Hey, Fran, I'm just glad we're actually talking about playing football this weekend. You know, there was a time when I think both of us were uncertain as to whether that might happen.
No question. It's been a long time, but we're all excited to get things going here. And let's talk about this matchup. We've got week one, divisional matchup, Philadelphia Eagles taking on the Washington football team. And I'm just thinking we'll kind of go down Washington's depth chart and just talk about the matchups here as we get closer and closer to this game. And let's talk about the Washington quarterback, Dwayne Haskins, entering his second year as the starter. He was named officially the starter last week. What did you see from Haskins last year? I know it was definitely a rocky start, but I thought personally that he got a little bit better as the season went on. We have honestly got to see him a little bit late in the season. What was it, week 15, week 16 last year? Interested to get your thoughts on Haskins and his development, what you've seen from him so far through 1 year.
Yeah, and I think that he clearly improved. It was incremental improvement. But I think when you talk about Haskins, you have to understand what kind of player that he is. He's essentially a pocket player. We know he lost some weight this offseason, and every quarterback has to have some movement ability, but I think his movement has to be within the pocket. He'll have to find ways to navigate within the pocket, climb the pocket, take a step or two to his right, to his left. He's not going to be a playmaker. He's not going to be a second reaction quarterback, which again doesn't mean he'll never do that, but that won't be the way he'll be successful over time. Now, he's a very good thrower of the football, and he's a snap thrower. He's not really a torque thrower. He's not really a weight transfer thrower. He's kind of a snap thrower, Fran, but he's got a very, very good arm. And one kind of throw he can make really effectively is he has the ability to make what I call firm touch throws. So he can very often get the ball versus zone, for instance, over linebackers. He has a nice ability to do that. So he's a quarterback that clearly showed improvement a year ago, and I'll be very anxious. He's one of those young quarterbacks that I'm very anxious to see how he does this season. And obviously playing a tough division game against the Eagles is a very good early test.
Yeah, no question. And also incorporating the new scheme, right? There in
Right.
Washington. Scott Turner being named the offensive coordinator under Ron Rivera. Scott Turner, we got to see in that role for the last few games down there in Carolina after Ron Rivera was fired at the end of last season. One of the things that's really stood out to me about watching that Carolina offense late in the season with Turner as the offensive coordinator, a lot of pre-snap motion, a lot of moving their players around. They've got a couple satellite-type players down there in Carolina, namely, obviously, Christian McCaffrey, but also Curtis Samuel. I thought we saw some really creative motions and shifts using those guys, moving them around, moving them into the backfield and into the slot with a lot of jet sweep action. Kind of just all that backfield stuff just to create some easy throws for Kyle Allen. I would anticipate that they'll do a lot of those things to create some easy layup throws for Dwayne Haskins as well.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that they focus on, and I think you're seeing this more and more in the league, Fran, is what we call pure progression. That's sort of the foundational approach of the Scott Turner offense. And by pure progression, we mean that you don't have to have a complete understanding of the defense. What you have to understand, obviously, is your route concept. So you have a primary, a secondary, and a third receiver, and you drop back within the timing of the play and the concept. If one is open, you throw it. If one is not open, it doesn't matter why he's not open. You don't have to understand all the nuances of the defense, but if one's not open, you go to two. If two's not open, you go to three. It's sort of one of the terms I learned this offseason, Fran, from a lot of coaches. I talk to offensive coaches, and I love this term, is functional knowledge. You need to have a functional knowledge of the defense as it relates to what you're running with your pass game concepts. And I think that's a foundation of what Scott Turner wants to do with Dwayne Haskins, a lot of pure progression so that he just understands in detail his offense, his pass game concepts, and then can make the necessary throws.
Yeah, to me, it's just going to be really interesting just to watch, Haskins in the structure of that offense. We talked about some of the things we saw from them, but, incorporating, and we can kind of transition to some of the things they've got around Haskins as well. You talk about those satellite players with Samuel and McCaffrey. I feel like they've got a few players that certainly can do some of those things in Washington. Obviously, Terry McLaurin's a player we're going to talk about, but, you talk about Steven Sims in the slot. He's got some interesting traits. We saw him as an undrafted free agent as a rookie last year, but then also the third-round pick in Antonio Gibson out of Memphis, who was essentially a slot receiver for Memphis last year. He played running back in the Senior Bowl. A lot of people viewed him as a potential running back because of his size and his athleticism, and now Washington is going to play him at the running back spot with Adrian Peterson cut. Obviously, no Darius Geist there as well. He's going to be the front runner, I would think, for a lot of touches, meaningful touches, both in the run game and the pass game.
Yeah, well, I mean, I saw him as a slot receiver, but obviously Washington views him as a running back. He's a big, powerful, explosive guy. He was one of my favorite players to watch on tape last year coming out of college. I watched all his pass targets. I watched some games. I've watched all his running plays. He's close to 230 pounds, and he's explosive. He's powerful. He's tough to tackle. I mean, I remember him in the wide receiver screen game, and I know you watched his tape as well, Fran, but he's a very, very difficult guy to tackle. But yet in the run game, he was very effective as well. I'm very curious to see the division of labor in their run game. Because, I don't know if they'll have one foundation back. I don't know whether if it will be Gibson. I don't know what Bryce Love will do. He's got some explosive traits as well. So we'll see what Washington chooses to do. But Gibson is a dynamic, explosive player.
Yeah, and I think you look at a guy like Peyton Barber, right, who was an early downs grinder type. I mean, he's got those physical qualities to be that type of player. I kind of feel like he can get some meat of some carries and then has the ability to be that guy early if they feel like, all right, Gibson will kind of grow into that role. But with all the motions, all the different things they can do creatively, I do think that it's going to be Gibson early on that it'll be kind of I don't want to say a game breaker, but has that potential in that offense.
Yeah, and the other thing to keep in mind that Scott Turner is a big believer in, and it comes from his father for sure, is the play-action pass game. And I think you'll see a lot of the play-action pass game when you look at this Washington offense, and that's something that I think that will definitely be a part of it. They're a big believer in throwing early and ideally being able to create big explosive plays early and then running the football, and we'll see how that plays out.
Yeah, I think when you're talking about big plays in the passing game for this team, I mean, we got to talk about Terry McLaurin, Greg. And I know you went back, you studied all of McLaurin's targets from last year. I did the same about a week and a half ago. He had a really impressive rookie year, man. For a lot of reasons. I mean, you talk about the athleticism for sure, but his refinement as a route runner, his ability to get in and out. He was great at the catch point. Made some outstanding catches at all three levels of the field last year. He was really, really impressive. He's going to be a high volume target, I think, in this offense.
I couldn't agree more. And I think when you go back and watch all his targets, as you did as well, you saw him run some outstanding routes against big-time corners. Stephon Gilmore, Darius Slay, who could well be matching up to him man-to-man with the Eagles in the game on Sunday. And the matchup with Slay was a really good one, with each player making plays. It's the matchup you're likely to see. I thought McLaurin was a really desirable combination of route quickness, separation quickness. He has vertical speed and explosiveness. To me, the way they used him too, I found interesting. He's a movement receiver. You want to get him the ball on the move to take advantage of his vertical speed and his quick transition from receiver to run after catch. But boy, he's a really impressive guy, and he's tough and competitive because he's not a big guy, but there's a competitiveness to him that you really like.
Yeah, and you talked about, we watched all of his targets. You talked about the matchup with him and Darius Slay. Watching all the plays from that game, I went back and just studied that game just to get a sense of that matchup. And I don't believe they matched up on every single play, but you did see him travel for a majority of the game, it felt like, with McLaurin. What were some of your takeaways from watching that matchup last year?
I believe it was 19 snaps, if memory serves me correctly. And I thought that both players had some good snaps, and it was a good matchup. I thought Slay was better in press than he was in off. I don't know what your thoughts were remembering it. So, I'm real anxious to see. I have to believe that matchup's happening on Sunday, and whether it happens on every play, it never works out exactly, because obviously I think you're going to see McLaurin on the move a lot. He doesn't just line up outside. He's predominantly their boundary X, the single receiver to the short side of the field, but they also move him around quite a bit. We've seen him line up in the slot, whether it's the conventional slot to twins or the inside slot to trips. I think we'll see him in motion as well, because you want to get him free access, because he can burst off the line of scrimmage. He's an explosive guy, and he can go from 0 to 60 in a heartbeat.
When you say free access, just let our listeners know, what do you mean by that?
Where you're not pressed, where you have room off the snap. When the ball's snapped, you have room to get into your route without any kind of disruption by a corner. And that happens a lot more often, obviously, when a receiver goes in motion.
So what are you most excited to see about with this Eagles secondary? I mean, obviously the addition of Darius Slay, Jalen Mills making the move to safety. Obviously we're not going to see Will Parks this week because he got put on short-term injured reserve coming into the year. But what excites you most about getting ready to watch this Eagles secondary in 2020?
I'm fascinated with Jalen Mills because, I've had the opportunity, what I do, Fran, is I see pretty much every team. And when they signed Will Parks, I really liked Will Parks' tape in Denver. And I thought he'd be the replacement for Malcolm Jenkins. And obviously Jalen Mills is the replacement for Malcolm Jenkins, and we'll see how the season plays out. But so I'm really curious to see how Mills fills that role. There's been a lot of talk, and you're there in the building. I'm not, but there's certainly been a lot of talk, and you would know that the Eagles are going to play more man coverage. When you get someone like Darius Slay, who's capable of matching up to any receiver in the league with his skill set and traits, and certainly with Avonte Maddox, who I really like the player, but because he's short, you're probably not looking to match him up to 6'3" receivers unless you're forced to. So I'm curious with Mills matching up. We know he's a corner, but he'll have to match up to tight ends who are bigger and more physical. And Mills is a competitive, feisty guy. But I'm just real curious to see how Jalen Mills plays out at safety. Now, as you know, he did play some safety at LSU, so it's not foreign to him to play this position.
Yeah, and for that reason, Greg, I feel like he's been really impressive this summer. Watching him every day, it does not seem like he's out of place. He's made plays on the ball every day, red zone, one-on-ones. He's looked good against the tight ends. I mean, he's had a pretty strong showing here this summer. I'm excited to see him, once things are live here this Sunday against Washington. it's going to be interesting to see how they deploy these guys. You talked about the matchup with Maddox and things of that nature. It's going to be just really interesting to see, and I think it'll change from week to week. Which I think, looking at this group of Washington weapons, we talk about McLaurin, we've talked about Gibson, and the kind of Swiss Army knife he can be. What are your thoughts on the rest of this group? I mean, they signed Dontrell Inman from the LA Chargers. I'd love to get your thoughts on Inman. We saw a little bit of Steven Sims last year as a slot weapon, as an undrafted free agent. They drafted Antonio Gandy-Golden as well out of Liberty. Interesting to get your thoughts on those three guys and how you feel they can impact this Washington receiving corps.
Yeah, Inman's a guy that I've always liked, to be honest with you. I mean, he's played with a lot of teams. He's not explosive, which is why he's moved around. But I always thought he was a really refined route runner. And I'm surprised that he's moved around so much. But he could well be the starter opposite McLaurin on the outside for Washington. We'll see where Antonio Gandy-Golden fits into this right now. It's certainly not a team that has a ton of tight end. So they're really going to have to rely on McLaurin and whatever else the wideout brings. It could be Inman, maybe it's Gandy-Golden. Sims is predominantly, I think, I don't know, is he the slot guy? He's certainly a guy you can line up anywhere in your formation. And that brings us back to Antonio Gibson, who I guess we could also see split. We could see J.D. McKissick.
I was just going to bring him up. Yep.
Who spent, when he was with Seattle, he lined up as a split receiver quite a bit. So you could see them take those kinds of players, Gibson, McKissick, and use them as split wide receivers depending on down and distance.
Yeah, I think that would be the idea. I feel if you're Washington, you're trying to take pressure off Dwayne Haskins, and the way to do that is really kind of mix things up with the different shifts, with the different pre-snap motions, the backfield actions, with all these quote unquote positionless, multiple versatile players, all those skill sets you've got with McKissick, with McLaurin, with Steven Sims. Just find different ways to serve as window dressing to create some easier throws for Haskins off of play action in particular. I got to think that's going to be the core of their game plan, right? I mean, that's the idea of what we've seen from Scott Turner in the past.
Yeah, and I think they'll be very big on the rhythm game because they're going to want him to be a ball distributor. They're going to want the ball to come out to players who have yak ability, run after catch ability. Gibson, Sims, players like that, get the ball in the hands of those kinds of players who can run after catch.
That was what he was at. I'm talking about Dwayne Haskins. That's when he was at his best at Ohio State, right? It was just like as a ball distributor, get the ball out quick and let his guys do work.
I mean, how many times did we see him throw screens or shallow crosses to Paris Campbell?
No question.
I mean, that was a major part of their offense. I think you'll see a lot of the same kinds of things.
Greg, the starting tight end is in Washington these days.
Who will be the starting tight end in Washington, Fran?
Logan Thomas.
Yes, who I thought would be a quarterback in the NFL.
So did I. And he's now made the transition over the last few years to the tight end position. It seems like he's had a good camp. For all intents and purposes, all the buzz out of Washington has been that he has had a good rapport with Dwayne Haskins and that he's going to be the number one guy. It's going to be really interesting. I mean, he's a very athletic kid, a big-bodied kid. We'll see. It's that's going to be kind of an interesting matchup to be able to watch. Just another like wild card player. Could that completely flame out? Sure, but with the athletic potential guy that big and who's been at the tight end position now for a few years, I'm interested to see what Logan Thomas looks like as the number one guy in that depth chart.
And, I've seen him through the years in various places he's been. He was in Buffalo. There's times where he's looked pretty good at tight end. And I guess it hasn't quite worked out yet, but I thought Jeremy Sprinkle had a chance to be a solid tight end in this league. Not a big time tight end, we're not talking top 5, but one of those guys who could catch the ball a bit and also be a pretty solid blocker. And obviously he's going to get meaningful snaps as well.
Yeah, I think so. Let's get to that offensive line because I feel like
that's the question, Fran. That's the question mark.
If you're Washington, I mentioned you're trying to take pressure off Haskins, but you're also trying to take pressure off that offensive line. And all those things we talked about with making it simple for Haskins also apply, namely to the left side of that offense. I feel like that's where the question marks are. You have Morgan Moses still at right tackle, Brandon Scherf at right guard. That's a pretty good right side of the offensive line. Chase Roulier at center is a proven starter, athletic kid. Scherf, I think, is one of the best offensive linemen in the league, one of the best guards for sure in the NFL, in my opinion. Then you go to the left side, and Wes Martin was drafted as I believe, a 4th-round pick last spring. So 2 springs ago, 2019. The plan was that he was going to be a starter right away. Didn't quite work out for him as a rookie. But then, look, they brought in Wes Schweitzer. Okay, it's going to be a competition this summer, new coaching staff. Wes Martin took over and was as it seems to be the number 1 guy at left guard. So that's your left guard. Then at left tackle, they didn't have Trent Williams last year. They played Donald Penn there. But Jaron Christian, former 3rd-round pick out of Louisville, was kind of waiting in the wings, was a raw kid, hadn't played a ton of football, and they took him in the 3rd round because of his tools. And now it seems like he's going to be the guy. Look, very athletic. Really light feet. He had 35.5-inch long arms. He had huge hands. I mean, looked the part. Now it's a matter of, all right, let's find out if this guy can play. And that's kind of where they're at right now with Jaron Christian.
And I agree. I mean, he's very athletic kid. I remember watching him coming out of Louisville, and you just love the tools. He had really light feet. And you just, look, they have to give Christian and Martin a shot. They were 3rd and 4th round draft picks different years, but they're young players. And, which gets back to another reason why I think you're going to see a lot of quick game and a lot of screens and a lot of things where the ball gets out of Haskins' hands quickly. Obviously, when it gets to be 3rd and 9, the whole situation is different. But ideally, no team wants to be in a lot of those long yardage situations. So I think you'll see them try to throw the ball when they want to throw the ball to get Haskins comfortable and then work the run game.
To me, that is if you're looking at that, what is a key matchup for the Eagles and where this could be a game-changing matchup.
Yes,
it's that Eagles defensive line against the Washington offensive line. I've talked a lot on this podcast about how impressive the defensive front has looked here in camp. Now it's okay. Is that because it was against a younger group of backup offensive linemen for much of the summer here, at the NovaCare complex, or is this defensive line really that disruptive, that dominant? And I feel like with a healthy Fletcher Cox, a healthy Malik Jackson leading the way on the inside, I'm excited to see this group. We know what Brandon Graham can be. Josh Sweat really came on in the last couple of weeks in camp, playing with the first team unit on the right side with Derek Barnett injured. Excited to see what those guys can bring. So let me ask you this question. I'll kind of start you off here because I mentioned a bunch of names there. Malik Jackson, give Eagles fans a little bit of a refresher because he missed most of the season last year. He missed everything after the first game. What kind of player is Malik Jackson when he's at his best?
He's long. He's athletic. He can play both D end and D tackle, rush the quarterback from either spot. He's probably at his best inside working against guards. But I think he's a pretty complete defensive tackle. When they made that signing last year, I was really, really pleased because I remember there wasn't a lot of talk about Malik Jackson, and that signing just seemed to come out of nowhere. And I thought it was a really, really good signing. I thought he was a really good player in Denver early on, and then he moved to Jacksonville. I think you could make the argument that when you look at this Eagles defensive line, if everybody plays well and plays to what they're supposed to be, it's one of the best in the league, and it's pretty deep. I mean, they've got a lot of depth on that D line. So to me, this is a game where the Eagles D line has to dominate because they're better than the O line of Washington, and they're going to have to dominate this game.
Yeah, I think when you look at what are the individual matchups, obviously we know that the Eagles defense, they'll move guys around a little bit. Fletcher Cox against Brandon Scherf, I feel like that's the matchup we'll typically see. That would put a Malik Jackson up against a Wes Martin. And look, I think for what we've seen from Isaac Seumalo throughout his career, we can surmise that Isaac Seumalo, very competent starting guard, if not a very good starting left guard. And Malik Jackson has had a really good camp against Isaac. So just seeing him against a inexperienced second-year guy in Martin, I think is going to be a really interesting matchup. And then when you look at Josh Sweat, or if Derek Barnett is able to come back as well, but looking at Josh Sweat, I'm excited to get your thoughts on what you saw from him and his development from year 1 to year 2 last year. I'll tell you, man, he's looked even better here this summer. Hopefully that's a good sign of things to come.
Well, he came out of high school as a big-time prospect, one of the best in the country. Yep. And the big issue with him, and I remember watching him in Florida State, and 2 things stood out. Number one, he was always in a 4-point stance, which nobody is in the NFL, certainly not to rush the quarterback. And number 2, he had that leg injury, and it always seemed like he was favoring it. And there were times where I watched him as an Eagle where I thought he was favoring it as well. But I think he's actually got a lot of talent. And I'm really curious to see now as he continues to progress And he'll be part of that rotation. He'll be a meaningful part of that rotation. He can rush the quarterback. He's an interesting guy because he's one of those guys, and I'm curious if you feel the same way. I don't think you watch him and go, wow, look at the way he moves. But then he just seems to move pretty well. He's not a splash player, but I think he's a really solid player, and he's a good pass rusher.
For a guy that big, because he's a big kid, I mean, to move as well as he does is impressive. And he's had a couple of those like, whoa moments here this summer. Interested to get your thoughts here as well. With Malik Jackson looking as good as he has, and obviously next to Fletcher Cox and all that, I think when you look at those two guys, and then you throw in a Javon Hargrave, who did not practice during training camp due to an injury suffered earlier in the summer, I think a lot of Eagles fans say, all right, well, what are the ways that you can get 3 defensive tackles on the field at one time? And I'm interested to get your thoughts. Is there a way in your mind that you can create situations for all 3 of those guys at once?
Well, we've seen Fletcher Cox line up at defensive end at times. Malik Jackson can certainly line up at defensive end. I think Jim Schwartz likes to line up with multiple fronts, particularly when you're in your sub, and whether it's nickel with 5 DBs or dime with 6 DBs. I think he's a multiple front defensive coordinator, and I think you'll see that. We've seen Fletcher Cox numerous times, going back to college at Mississippi State, where he lined up at defensive end. Shoot, I remember watching him at Mississippi State rush the quarterback at DN, thinking, God, this guy could even play DN in the NFL. So I think you'll see that. I think you'll see a lot of multiple front looks, as I said, out of their sub fronts, and you could easily do that. Malik Jackson, as I said, can do that as well.
And I kind of wonder too, like if you go back, the Eagles have been over the last couple of years like a big user of like the proponent of the diamond front, right? The 5-over-5 looks. Yeah. And I kind of, and I think when you look at that front, essentially it's one-on-one matchup. So you want to get your best passers on the field, right? So like if those are the 3 D tackles, like get all 3 of those guys on the field and say, all right, you beat the center and the 2 right guards. Let's figure this out.
Yeah, and I think that's the plan when you line up in that diamond front 5 across, because it pretty much dictates from a protection standpoint one-on-one. And obviously you can't change your protection in the middle of the play. So you get the one-on-ones, and that's what you're looking for. You know what you're going to get. Yeah,
and I think, honestly, we can make this transition now to the other side of the football. So Washington's defense against the Eagles' offense. I think when you look at this Washington defensive front,
that's really good too.
It's really good too, and I feel like you're going to see a lot of the similar stuff, right? Because they go 3 deep at D tackle with Deron Payne, Jonathan Allen, Matt Ioannidis, all 3. And by the way, Tim Settle, no slouch either. Tim Settle is
a good player.
Yeah, no question. And that's what they're saying. I feel the same way about Hassan Ridgeway, who's the 4th D tackle for the Eagles. I think both of these teams go 4 deep at D tackle, and then you look at Washington as well. You got Ryan Kerrigan, Montez Sweat, Chase Young. Jordan Brailford, I've heard, has had a good camp. James Smith-Williams, the kid from the pass rusher from NC State, I've heard has had a good camp. They have Ryan Anderson there as well. So very deep defensive front. How do you look at this group overall? Who is it that stands out most in your mind from this group?
I love Deron Payne. He's one of my favorite players. For a man that size, the way he moves, Jonathan Allen's a good player too. Obviously, they're both from Alabama. I like Payne more. Watching Payne, and I don't know if he'll ever get 15 sacks. That's irrelevant to me. But the way he can move and bend with his flexibility for a defensive tackle, I think is really interesting. The other thing too, with Ron Rivera there now and with Jack Del Rio, I think we saw Ron Rivera last year in Carolina do a lot with his fronts using multiple people, 3 DNs. He could certainly do that here. Use a lot of multiple stunt concepts. There were times he lined up in what looked like 3-4 fronts in Carolina. So I think you'll see a lot of different things. We know Ryan Kerrigan, who in this quote-unquote 4-3 front is now lining up at DN. He's been a 3-4 outside linebacker and a base for a long time, and obviously, rushes the quarterback in a sub. But they've got a lot of different pieces as well, players that can line up in different spots. And we'll see about Chase Young, very, very talented kid. Really looks the part, really good quickness and explosive athlete.
Yeah, I mean, Young missed a chunk of camp at the beginning due to a hip injury. Seems to have come on like gangbusters in the back end of camp. And from all reports, it seemed to have a strong summer to close out the abbreviated training camp. It's going to be interesting to see how they use all 3 of these guys, right? Because, obviously you have an established guy, a locker room guy in Ryan Kerrigan, who's still a very good player. Sweat, who I thought showed really good flashes last year. And from all reports, one of the best players in the entire training camp this summer. Montez Sweat seemed to be making plays every single day. I thought you saw a pretty advanced pass rush plan for a young player last year in Washington. Really good long arm move, wants to get inside your pads. For Jason, and now Jason Peters, it was announced on Monday from Doug Peterson, he will be making the move back to left tackle. So that is the matchup, I guess. If Sweat is coming off the defensive right side, he'll be matched up against Jason Peters. Lane Johnson, if healthy, because he's been battling that lower body injury, going up against Kerrigan or Chase Young as well on that right side.
Yeah, and I think you'll see Chase Young as well, lining up against Jason Peters. And look, Jason Peters he's at this point, he's the Eagles' best option at left tackle. He had an up and down year a year ago. We'll see how he is this year. Again, now if you start looking at the Eagles' offense, I think because of injuries at wide receiver with Rieger out, I think you'll see a lot of quick game. I think you'll see a lot of two tight ends. Look, down the stretch last year when they won those final four to make the playoffs, they played with two tight ends over 50% of their snaps. It would not surprise me if that's pretty much how they see this week one matchup versus Washington.
And just seeing how Washington will try and match up to that, I think will be fascinating. And we can get into some of that a little bit here in a minute. The one guy I feel like we haven't talked about yet is Jonathan Allen. And he's gotten a lot of pub, because he's been a top 15 pick. He came from Alabama. I feel like he gets even a little bit more pub than Payne. I agree with you that I kind of like Payne a little bit more, but Allen, a very well-rounded player that I'm interested to see, like now that he's sliding inside as more of a 3 technique, on a consistent basis, what he looks like from that position full time, as opposed to being kind of a 4-eye or a 5 technique on base downs.
Yeah, I'm very curious about that, but they're both good players, Payne and Allen. I mean, it's it's a really good front. The question will be, in my view, is their linebackers, because I think the Eagles will line up a ton in 12, and now you get into their linebacking core, which I think is. I think it's a little bit of a question. I actually liked what I saw from Cole Holcomb a year ago. I think he's a solid player. They brought in Thomas Davis, I think, because he knows Ron Rivera's defense. He can teach the young players, including John Dion Hamilton. They brought back Bostic. Ryan Anderson, to me, is more of a pass rusher.
Right.
I don't think, again, putting aside Thomas Davis, I don't think that they have great athleticism at linebacker.
So the only guy that I feel like brings that level of athleticism and movement is a guy that they did sign in free agency this year, and it seems like
Kevin Pierre-Louis.
Kevin Pierre-Louis, and it seems like he's going to get the starting nod on the weak side ahead of Holcomb this year, based off training camp and how they rotated guys. So apparently, from with me reading all the reports coming out of Washington, it seems like Sean Dion Hamilton has been the guy and has been the 3-down player, and getting guys lined up and everything. Bostic has been in there in nickel and rotating with Kevin Pierre-Louis, similar to the situation here in Philadelphia, where Nate Gary has been the 3-down player through camp, and there's been a rotation with Duke Riley and TJ Edwards. It seems like it's the same kind of thing with Bostic and Kevin Pierre-Louis, with Cole Holcomb as the 4th linebacker.
Well, Kevin Pierre-Louis has been with a lot of teams, and I'm surprised because I really liked him coming out of Boston College. If I recall correctly, I believe he was in the same draft with Ryan Shazier, and I thought his athleticism was pretty close to Shazier's, and I'm surprised that he hasn't been able to stick, particularly in today's NFL where you want speed and movement at the linebacker position. So maybe he's finally found a home at this point in his career, but he is their most athletic linebacker.
So he would be a guy that if they're playing man coverage, in theory, could be matched up with like a Miles Sanders in space, in theory.
Or a tight end. I mean, it depends, I guess, on how much man-to-man they're going to play.
Right, exactly. Yeah. To me, that's something to certainly watch. Obviously, Carolina, under Ron Rivera, heavy zone, right? I mean, that's kind of a heavy cover two, a lot of quarters coverage. That seemed to be the theme. I haven't studied them as closely as you have over the years.
No, but I think in an ideal world, everybody plays man at times.
Of course, yes.
But I think they're more zone-based. There was a lot of quarters. I guess the big issue will be Del Rio and Rivera, who's going to make those calls, because I think with Del Rio, you'd see some cover 3. But in Carolina, they played a lot of cover 4.
When Del Rio was last in Oakland, I mean, it seemed like they were running more of like the Seattle stuff with trying to think of the defense coordinator at the time. But it seemed like they were running more in terms of like that idea. Has that been Del Rio's identity, more of a cover 3 single high over the course of his career?
I think so. Yeah. I can't remember it, in detail, but
of course.
I think that, yes, But I think bottom line is, I think they'll be more zone-based than man-based.
Yeah, which will be, I mean, that's kind of interesting in this matchup when you talk about what the Eagles bring in terms of the pass catchers. Obviously, Deshaun Jackson returned to the lineup, has looked good this summer. Excited to see what he looks like on the field back in this Eagles offense. You mentioned Jalen Reagor kind of nursing that upper body injury. So we'll see what if he's able to go. It doesn't seem that way, but we'll see if he's able to go. But, when you've got J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, who Greg, he has had a nice summer, man. He looks a little bit looser athletically, a little bit more refined as a route runner. He's caught pretty much everything thrown his way. He's had a couple drops here and there, but overall, I think Arcega-Whiteside has looked good. Greg Ward in the slot. John Hightower's had a nice camp. Excited to see these guys. Kind of a new look pass, especially from the end of last season. It's going to be a lot of new pass catchers for Carson Wentz.
Well, I'm excited to see Hightower. I liked his tape coming out of Boise. I made a note when I do my evaluations that I thought he was an ascending talent. I thought he needed to get stronger. He's thin, and we'll see how that plays out once the regular season starts. But he's an explosive kid, and I'm real anxious to see. I don't know, how many snaps he'll get. Who knows that? I mean, obviously with Reagor out, we don't know. But the Arcega-Whiteside situation is interesting because obviously he was a second-round pick, and they didn't get much out of him last year, and we know he had some struggles in making the transition. But there's no way that a wide receiver is a bust after 1 year, so we do have to wait and see on that.
What are your thoughts? I feel like we're past the point of when we're talking about Carson Wentz of, oh, well, how did he look in camp? What did he complete? How many passes did he complete? We're like at this point, I feel like Carson Wentz is like established as one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, certainly one of the most talented quarterbacks in the NFL. Coming into this year, Press Taylor named as pass game coordinator. The team brings in, they bring back Marty Mornhinweg. They bring in Rich Scangarello. Interested to get your thoughts just on Carson and this pass game offense transitioning here into 2020. What do you think you're expecting to see here when they take the field here Sunday?
Well, what I would say with Carson, and you know how much I like Carson Wentz, and by the way, in talking to a lot of coaches this summer, I heard a lot of coaches tell me that they thought after Mahomes that Wentz was the most talented quarterback in the league. So, I mean, I don't think there's a question about Carson Wentz's talent. I think one of the main things that you're continually working with him on, and I think it's important, is he's much more of a playmaker type of quarterback, both throwing from the pocket and with his outstanding second reaction ability, than he is kind of a nuanced, subtle pocket passer. And I think what you always want to work on with him is to get him to be as consistent as he can possibly be, snap after snap from the pocket. I think he's got a playmaking mindset. I think he's really good at that. I think he showed last year down the stretch in the final 4 games that when he has to play sort of within structure and tightly rhythmic, that he's more than capable of doing that. But I think it's something that they continue to have to work on. And if they can get him to do that, I think you're dealing with a guy who can be absolutely great.
Yeah, he's certainly, every day it seemed in camp, he would make a throw that makes like, all right, like, yep, there's Carson Wentz again. Like, you know what I mean? Like, this summer felt a little bit different where we weren't talking about, oh, how does he look coming off an injury? How does he look here? Where is he in terms of his development? I feel this was the first summer where it just felt like, all right, like Carson Wentz is Carson Wentz.
But, it's funny you say what you said, because I feel like in the general discussion that a lot of people have forgotten about him.
Yeah.
And, I think he's a pretty darn good quarterback. Then you start getting into lists, which I'm a big fan of.
Of course.
Yeah. So, that's just, who's better. Carson Wentz is a high-level NFL quarterback, and I would expect him to have a good season. And like I said, I don't view him as a totally finished product. And I think if you're being honest and fair, he's not. But there's certainly a ton there, and he's really, really talented.
I mean, our listeners can't see you like I can see you right now, but I'm looking over your shoulder. I feel like there's that's a list of all the top quarterbacks ranked in order right behind you over your shoulder on your bulletin board in your office.
Actually, it's not, but that's, yeah.
All right, let's get to this Washington secondary. You talked to me, primarily zone coverage. They bring back Kendall Fuller, who the team traded to Kansas City. He ends up back in Washington in free agency this year, so he's reacquired. He's back. The team signed Ronald Darby, who obviously Eagles fans are well aware of. The Eagles offense very well aware of. What he brings to the table. Jimmy Moreland in the slot. Fabian Moreau is back as a backup outside corner. Greg Stroman still there. Aaron Colvin. They've got some names at the cornerback position.
I think the big surprise here, because they had signed Sean Davis, who they since cut, and I spoke to a Washington reporter the big surprise in camp was Troy Apke, who's going to start at free safety.
Yeah, he was a former third-round pick out of Penn State. Ripped up the combine. I actually kind of liked him on film, Craig, when you're just watching him on film there.
He's an explosive athlete.
No question. So it seems like he's going to play as the starting safety next to Landon Collins. What are your thoughts there? Obviously, like you said, at the very most, people expected, it's going to be a competition between Davis and Apke. Apke got all the first-team reps, and that was it. I mean, he came in with 2 career starts, but he's going to be the guy, it seems, this year at free safety.
They're a team that has a defined strong safety and free safety, which a lot of teams don't love to have, but Landon Collins is a strong safety. He's not a free safety, which doesn't mean there won't be a snap or two that he doesn't play on the back end, but that's not what he is. So they have a defined situation. Landon Collins matches up to tight ends. Apke will be the free safety. And again, I think they'll play more zone, in which case Collins will probably be an underneath defender and Apke will be the post safety, unless they're in quarters, in which, they'll both be deep half players. But I'm very curious to see Apke because, he's an explosive athlete. You're right. He blew up the combine. He ran under a 4.40. I don't remember much of him, from Washington last year. I didn't study him in detail, but he's an athlete. I mean, he can cover ground. He can run. So we'll see. And we'll see how the corner position plays out. Fuller will absolutely be a starter. I guess Darby right now, but, Fabian Moreau, I think, still in the mix. We'll see with a new coaching staff and with this pandemic off season, we'll see how it all plays out.
Yeah, no question. I think that's going to be very interesting to see those guys on the outside. I feel like Moreland is probably established as that nickel corner.
I liked him last year too. I don't know your thoughts.
I did.
He's going to be a solid slot player.
Yeah, and to me, it'll be interesting, though, because I feel like I liked him in man coverage. I'm interested to see him in more of a zone look this year and see, how he performs in that kind of a scheme.
Yeah, I mean, this is a defense I think their defensive front's really good. Washington's linebacker core has some questions, as we know, and so does their secondary. So I think it's their back end that you want to feel that you can attack.
Yeah, to me, like you're talking big matchup on the Eagles offense against Washington defense. It's pass game related, like being able to attack that secondary. And then on the Eagles offensive side, or the Eagles defensive side, rather, it's the Eagles defensive line against that Washington offensive line. I feel like those are the matchups the Eagles need to win to get going in this game, would be my summation.
Yeah, I mean, I think their front four's got to dominate the Washington offensive line. Haskins cannot get comfortable in this game. They'll try to get him comfortable with their approach. It'll be a lot of quick game. It'll be, those kinds of throws. They're not going to ask him to have deep drops. They'll take a shot with play action and for sure with maximum protection, with a 7-man protection. But for the most part, I think they'll want the ball out of his hands. I'm curious to see, and we don't know. We don't know the answer to these questions, what their balance will be between run and pass. I think that Scott Turner, in an ideal world, would like to throw early and create explosive plays, but he does have an offensive line issue.
Well, Greg, we will be talking about this matchup 1 week from tonight. The Eagles take the field Sunday, 1:00. We will be back Monday night. You'll probably be listening to it Tuesday morning to recap that game. Excited to get this thing going with you, Greg.
I can't wait, Fran. I'm so excited. Just can't wait to watch the game Thursday night, too.
I know.
I'm so excited for this weekend.
We've got a little bit of a taste of college football this weekend. Not a ton of games, but a handful just to kind of wet our beaks a little bit. And now the real thing starts Thursday night and then obviously Sunday afternoon. Greg, excited to talk things through with you next week, man. Thanks so much again for joining us on the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, fueled by Gatorade.
Thanks, Fran.
Great stuff from Greg, and you can follow on Twitter just like I do at Greg Cosell. And while you're at it, I'm at Eagles XOs. That's where I post all the podcasts I'm a part of and all of our X's and O's content that we produce at PhiladelphiaEagles.com. And you know how much I appreciate everybody that promotes this podcast on all forms of social media. That's one way to support the show, but the best way is to go on Apple Podcasts or Stitcher, leave us a rating, or even leave us a comment. I wanted to give a shout out today to a handful of people that went on and left questions that I wanted to make sure were answered here. Jones 471 left us a 3-star review and a comment saying that we need to focus on the game of football. There's enough depressing podcasts for people to listen to if they want to. Let us have one podcast where we can zone out and focus on something other than the harsh realities of life for 40 minutes. And Jones, I'm sorry. I'm assuming you're referring to the episode that from last week that made you feel uncomfortable with myself and Chris McPherson. I would argue that we all need to feel a little bit more uncomfortable, at the very least, with everything that's going on. And one of the points that we made in that discussion was, we need to feel this way. And I don't know what else more to say about it. So I'm sorry that you didn't like that episode. I would say that we talk about football 99% of the time here on this podcast. We spend about 20 minutes of one episode talking about some very serious topics that are a little bit more important. I'm sorry you didn't like that, but I'm not going to sit silently and ignore those issues either. But another comment here. Better him than me left a 5-star review saying he appreciated our discussion addressing the plight of black people in America, and also left a question: why are division games so close regardless of team records every year for the most part? Is it just familiarity of playing teams twice a year, or do teams in the NFC East build their teams to compete specifically against other teams in the division? There is a different NFC East division winner every year since TO. Something is at play. Better him than me. Great question. That stat is actually one of my favorite stats in all the NFL. A different division winner every year since 2005. I mean, that is insane. But to answer your question, it's a little bit of everything, right? And I think a lot what you said is exactly right. And this isn't just in the NFC East. This is in every division in football. If you ask a head coach, and namely if you ask a general manager, they will almost always say, you have to build your team to win a division. I know a lot of general managers around their offices, around the NFL, not only do they have their own depth chart up on the wall with the magnets and the names and everything, but they will have the depth charts of all of their division opponents and sometimes even a couple other teams from their conference up, just so you can always have that visual of how your roster matches up with your peers, with the other teams that you're competing for those playoff spots with. So that is certainly a big part of it, and you see that all around the league in terms of how teams are building their own rosters. They will say, well, we have to beat to contend with such and such division winner or such and such team that just won the Super Bowl. That's always at the forefront of team builders' minds. Then the other part of it is exactly what you said. When you see an opponent twice a year, year over year over year, if there's continuity in staff and personnel and things of that nature, just think about it. It's not just 2 games. It's not just, we see them 2 days. It's that you have another full week of preparation, of understanding their concepts, both offensively, defensively, tendencies with whether it comes to play calling or just tendencies to personnel. The relationships are a little bit more familiar. Everything that you're doing in terms of that preparation is it makes it a little bit more tight. And I think when you're looking at a game of inches, right? Football's a game of inches. Well, when you're talking about divisional matchups, it's a game of centimeters. It's so much closer than just a normal game. And to me, that's why when people say when it's a division matchup, throw the records out and all that stuff. It's absolutely true because those teams know each other in and out. And so if you don't bring your A game in those divisional games, you're more than likely you're going to come out with an L. So great question there from Better Him Than Me. Last one here from Otel Boys, left a 5-star review, said how much they love the podcast. I like the signing of Trevor Williams this offseason. He has proven in his short career that he can play. Do you see him jumping guys to make this team, or is he just a camp body? So look, obviously we know Final Cut Day has come and gone. He did not make the 53-man roster. But to me, I think Trevor Williams kind of hurt by a lack of not just an offseason where you can come in the spring and the early summer to kind of prove himself, but also the shortened roster where the teams had to get from 90 to 80, and he was just on the outside looking in because you have some other young players that you're trying to get a look at and try and get a sense of. There's plenty of film out there on Trevor Williams. There's not a lot of guesswork needed there. So while you understood what he could bring, and he ended up coming back to the team midway through camp, you might want to take a look at some of the other young guys, and even if they don't make the 53, you at least want to get a sense, get them in your building, understand what they can do, get some additional NFL quality film on those guys. So to me, and I've said this before, it was a really competitive bottom end of the roster this year, and I think obviously a lot of that has to go with trimming the roster from 90 to 80, but I thought that a lot of the guys on the bottom end of this roster really came back and did some really good things across, not just in the secondary, but across the board on this depth chart, which was really good to see. It made for some really competitive battles, whether it was in team drills or in one-on-ones. So great questions there from Otal Boys, Better Him Than Me, and yes, even you, Jones471. Real quick, I want to remind you guys that about our new in-season podcast schedule here at Eagles Entertainment. I told you the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, we're now twice a week. I'll be back with Ben Fennell later this week. You can also catch Ben and I twice a week as well over on the Journey to the Draft podcast driven by AAA. That will be released every Tuesday and every Thursday during the season. The Eagles Insider podcast with Dave Spadaro, that will go back to being 3 times a week. So you have your post-game show, and then again on Wednesdays and Fridays. Lastly, there's the Eagles Update podcast, which you can subscribe to wherever podcasts can be found. Those are going to be short little news updates that you can start your day with or you can end your day with every day, Monday through Saturday. And you can find all of these shows wherever podcasts can be found. Make sure you can go and subscribe to all of them. Now, special thanks to Greg Cosell and all of you out there for your continued support of not only this show, but all of our podcast offerings that I just talked about on PhiladelphiaEagles.com. All that being said, I think that'll do it. Another show in the books here on the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, fueled by Gatorade, for everybody here at the NovaCare Complex. I am Fran Duffy. We'll talk to you later this week.